Hi everybody. For today's lecture, we are going to be focusing on heart anatomy, and we eventually dive into the chambers of the heart, blood vessels of the heart, and the valves of the heart for starters, and we also talk about the location of the heart in a sense of your thoracic cavity. So when we're talking about your heart, we discussed this earlier as well when we discussed blood vessels in general. One of the key points that we hinted on was the two circulation that we have, which is known as pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. Now, again, to kind of review this information, anytime you hear the word pulmonary imply your lungs, and when we talk about systemic, we're talking about systems of the body. So when you're talking about pulmonary, the goal of this is to send pump blood again to the lungs. This is the goal. And what it does, it gets rid of CO2 and it picks up O2. So as you will learn, the word that we're going to use is basically what you start with is oxygen poor blood, which we refer to it as also deoxygenated, because D implies lack of, right? Oxy implies oxygen. So deoxygenated blood implies oxygen poor blood. That is going to go to your lungs, and you get rid of the CO2, which you have at high concentration, and you pick up the oxygen, and at that sense, your blood becomes oxygenated. Now, when blood is oxygenated, it actually returns to the left side of the heart, where it basically, again, you get the oxygenated blood, and that blood can be used by your tissues, or in a sense, organs of the body. And organs are made up your organ systems. So the oxygenated blood is going to be used by your systemic circle or systemic circulation. Now, as we will discuss this again, it's going to come up over and over again. Anytime we have deoxygenated blood, the color we're going to use to describe it would be blue. And if the blood is oxygenated, the color would be represented in red. And this is almost uniform for all of the textbook or any resources that describes heart anatomy. So let's go ahead and take a look at the location of the heart before we go any further and look at the actual heart anatomy itself. So first of all, heart is a pump that is located at the center of your thoracic cavity. If you want to figure out how big your size of the heart is, it's an individual basis. It's typically the size of your fist. And the weight is really, compared to your total body weight, is relatively small. It's about a pound in average, or a little bit less than a pound. Now, if you guys remember your body cavities, we had the mediastinum, which is basically the area where the heart sits. We refer to it also as pericardial location. And more specifically, if you want to look at them, they're located between the second all the way to the fifth intercostal space. Intercostal space just implies your ribs. So costal, anytime you hear this word, that implies ribs. So intercostal basically means that it sits between second rib all the way to the fifth rib. It sits above the diaphragm, which is basically the dome-shaped muscle that we have in our body. And it is anterior to your vertebral column. So basically, if you want to think about the spinal cord, your heart sits in front of it. And it's posterior to sternum, which is basically your breastbone. Breastbone, which is the bone that if you have basically open heart surgery, this is the bone that basically they cut through to get access to the heart itself. Here is a better representation or representation of the heart in a diagram. So right here, what you see down here as this line right here, as it's labeled, it is the diaphragm. This is the location of the heart between the second and the fifth rib. And notice that the bottom side of the heart actually rests on the diaphragm. Now a couple of new words. This pointy part of the heart you see right here, pointing to the left side, because this is your left, is referred to as the apex. And the top region of the heart, where you have all of the blood vessels either enter or exit the heart, is referred to as the base. Now, this is a view, if you want to kind of look at it closely. This is a cut, which we refer to it as the transverse cut. And you can see the lungs on either side. And then at the central region, you have your heart. The cavity that holds the heart, called the pericardium, and this represents your vertebral column. So we said your heart is in front of it, and what you see here, that is the sternum or the breastbone. So your heart sits behind that. Now let's take a look at your heart and the layers that surround your heart. So please be careful when we use this vocabulary. So we have layers that are going to be surrounding the heart or covering the heart, and typically these layers have a protective function. And we also have layers that form the heart itself. So there are 3 layers that form the heart itself, and 2 layers that are basically form the area or covering of the heart. So the layer that covers the heart is called the pericardium, same thing as the cavity. Notice this is a double-walled membrane or sac that surrounds the heart. The superficial one, which is the one that is going to surround your heart, is called fibrous pericardium. Fibrous implies what? Lots of protein fibers. Fibers. So this is extremely important in a sense of protection. So notice what the function? Protect. It also anchors the heart to the area around it. And a really cool fact that we'll discuss it when you actually look at the heart in your lab is that it prevents overfilling your heart. So basically it shows, think about it as you put your heart in a box and you say you cannot get bigger than this. It doesn't matter how much blood you want to push into it, it's not going to get bigger than that. Now, the deeper layer to the fibrous pericardium is called the serous pericardium. And again, this should be a reminder for you. Serous was a double layer membrane which has parietal layer and visceral layer. So this gets a little bit tricky, so follow me please. Parietal layer is lining the internal fibrous pericardium, which means parietal layer is closest to your fibrous pericardium. The second layer, the inner layer of the serous membrane, which we call visceral, it's actually coming in, it's part of the heart itself, and we refer to it as epicardium. Epi implied above the heart. So epicardium is the surface or part of the heart itself, and it is considered to be also a layer of the heart. Sorry, I should say it's a layer of the heart and also part of the covering of the heart. So the space, if you look at this layer, so let's say this one represents your parietal and this layer represents your visceral, the gap you have between them is referred to as the pericardial cavity. It is filled with fluid, so this space you have is basically filled with fluid. And the goal of this is that as the heart starts to beat, you want to limit the rubbing of these surfaces against each other to increase friction. So as the fluid is introduced, it acts as a lubricant to decrease the friction between these 2 layers. So let's take a look at these layers in a picture. So what you have, again, this is basically they're showing you the heart and the covering around it. The outer layer, what you see is a double layer. Right here is one layer. This is the second layer. This is the outer layer, fibrous pericardium, act as a protection. Then you have this layer right here. This is the parietal layer, and notice how it's connected to the fibrous. Then you have your gap, which is the pericardial cavity. And then this layer you have inside will be identified as what? Visceral layer of the pericardium, which, as we learn, is also called the epicardium. Notice on the side, guys, epicardium, you see this bracket right here? Epicardium, which is also the visceral layer of pericardium, is part of the heart wall. It's not a separate layer. So keep that in mind. Now, going back to the concept of homeostasis and keeping and maintaining balances in the body, we have a homeostatic imbalance, which basically means you have a disorder called pericarditis. This is representing an inflammation of the pericardium, the layers that surrounds the heart. What happens is that the roughened membrane surface is present, and it creates or increases the friction as the heart starts to beat or continues to beat. This creates a creaking or cracking sounds that is actually heard by the stethoscopes. The other thing is when you have excess fluid that is present within the pericardial space. So the space we represented here, this is space. We have fluid that is essential for basically limiting the friction as the heart beats. But if you have excess fluid, this fluid can actually leak into the pericardial space, and I should say there is excess fluid that will basically be surrounding the heart. I mean, that's the best way to put it. And that causes basically the ability of the heart to decrease, because it starts to push down on the heart, and heart will not be able to pump as effectively. So you might actually seen that this is typically used in the movies, like when they hear the heart and then they put this giant needle in the heart. And again, this is in the movies. In reality, it would be more slowly and more carefully. But what they do is they put a syringe into this space, right? And they remove the extra fluid from the cavity. And when that fluid is removed, you basically allow the heart to basically open up, relax completely, and fill up with blood, rather than being compressed because there's too much fluid built up around the heart. Now, we talked about the layers that cover the heart. Now, let's focus on the layers that are going to basically form the heart itself. So, there's 3 layers of the heart. We talked about the first one already. The first one was called the epicardium. And epicardium was the same thing as the visceral layer of pericardium. Now, look at this word, myocardium. Myo implies muscle. So myocardium, cardio implies heart. So myocardium implies what? Cardiac muscle cells. So this is basically majority of the heart layer, because what is the job of your heart? Is to pump. How do you pump? How do you create contraction? You use cardiac muscle. So a couple of information about them. You have a couple of pieces of information about myocardium. It anchors cardiac muscle fibers. If you're talking about the building blocks for the myocardium and the connective tissue that are present as part of it, it anchors the cardiac muscle fibers. It makes sure basically you don't have much of a movement in them. It supports the great blood vessels and valves. We'll see and we'll take a look at them, how they relate to it. These are blood vessels such as aorta, your pulmonary trunk, and valves such as the semilunar valves and the AV valves. And last one is limit the spread of action potential to a specific path. This is really important, because if the electrical impulses can go anywhere without having any direction. That causes significant problems in the ability of the heart to effectively act as a pump. So you take away, if these isolations and these potentials are not controlled, then you will not get an effective pumping action from the heart. Lastly, we have endocardium. Endo implies inside. If you guys again look back at your vocabulary we learned earlier, and inside is basically innermost layer of the heart. This is the layer that actually comes into contact with blood itself. It continues with a layer called endothelial, which basically means an epithelial layer that is inside. And it becomes the lining of the blood vessels. And as I mentioned, it lines the heart chambers. It lines the heart chambers, and it also covers the cardiac skeletal of the valves. Let's take a look at this picture to describe the three layers. Sorry. So what we have again, we have this layer right here, which is the visceral pericardium, also known as the epicardium. Notice this thickness right here. This is the myocardium, so muscle of the heart. And this is the inner layer right here, which is called the endocardium. This is the cardiac muscle bundles that we mentioned. This is basically, you see a very specific pattern. This is extremely important for the functionality of the heart as a pump. So, few notes to remember. These are extremely important, guys. So if you are taking notes as you go, make sure you use your color coding. We're going to use two main color coding. One is going to be red, and red is going to represent, and it's always true, oxygenated blood in a sense of coloring. It represents oxygenated blood, which means low CO2 and high O2 concentration. This is always associated with the left side of the heart, and it is pumped through, this is a different way of writing it, it is pumped through your systemic circulation. This is basically going to supply your tissues and cells with oxygen. The second thing we have is deoxygenated blood, or second condition for blood is deoxygenated blood, and as the name implies, again, it means lack of oxygen. So this would be high in CO2 and low in O2. It is always associated with the right side of the heart, and it goes to your lungs, which we refer to it as pulmonary. Okay, just remember that. When this blue, quote unquote, blue blood or deoxygenated blood reaches your lung, you basically oxygenate that blood and return it back to the left side of the body, left side of the heart. So let's quickly get introduced to the chambers of the heart, and then we'll continue in the next PowerPoint. So in your heart, you have 4 chambers. So I'm going to do a quick drawing for you guys. If you do basically the chambers. This is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. So notice you have 2 chambers on the top, 2 chambers on the bottom. The chambers on the top are referred to as the atrium. So this is an atrium. This is also an atrium. And down here we have chambers referred to as the ventricle and ventricle. So right here we have the right atrium and left atrium. Again, remember, right is deoxygenated blood, so it's blood that is need to go to the lungs to be oxygenated. And the left atrium is receiving blood that is coming from the lungs that has been oxygenated, and it is basically returning blood from the pulmonary circuit. Now, what is the function of the top chambers of the heart? They are received, their function is to receive blood to the heart. So if you want to introduce blood into the heart, basically, if you look at this, if you look at the blood vessel, what you see is on the top chambers, we have blood coming in, and these are identified as the receiving chambers of the heart. And then the chambers that are sitting on the bottom are identified as pumping chambers of the heart. Think about your heart as a pump, right? So when we're associating this as the left ventricle, it's gonna pump blood out of the heart, and the right ventricle is gonna pump blood out of the right side of the heart. So let's review the information. Right side of the heart, we said, is associated with the pulmonary circulation. So when right ventricle is pumping, the destination for that blood would be going to your lungs. The left ventricle is pumping blood to the systemic circulation, so this blood is going to go to your tissue or your systems of the body. So right side is associated with pulmonary, left side is associated with systemic. Right side ventricle is going to pump blood to your lungs, pulmonary circuit, and left side is going to pump blood to your to your systems or your tissue, hence the systemic circulation. Okay guys, we're gonna finish up and we'll pick up the rest of the information in your second PowerPoint.